How many people across the world are actively using their phone at any given moment? Assumptions. So all cell phones are considered active cell phones. So when I say their phone, I mean cell phones here. I'm also assuming that the cell phone use is similar, has a similar pattern in each time zone. So for example, if the busiest time of the day is midday because everybody's awake in Europe, it's going to have a similar pattern in North America, where at noon everybody is the most active. The population is evenly spread out over the globe, and that is a fairly large assumption to make because it simplifies the problem, but as we know, there's nobody living in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so it's going to have an effect on the calculation. So my first job was to find out how many cell phone users there are in the world. I started my search with Wikipedia, and Wikipedia has a table that is fairly recent, 2018, and it lists the number of smartphone users. I did not add these up by hand. What I did was I used an Excel spreadsheet to add them up. I copied the data and then quickly added them up that way, and yes, the answer was about 2.7 billion users. Then I thought I needed to double check that, and so I went to a statistical website and Googled this number of smartphone users, and the answer varied a little bit, but was fairly close. Notice that in 2018 it was 2.53, which is a little bit lower than my 2.7 billion, but by 2019 they estimate that it would be 2.71 billion. So they're in the right ballpark. So my assumption is that the number of cell phone users is 2.7 billion worldwide. My next task was to figure out how many hours everybody spends on their cell phones. And I went to the same website that I used to double check the number of cell phones that are in use, Statista, and they had a beautiful bar graph that showed the number of hours people spend online via a mobile device. Now, a little bit hesitant here, mobile device, it could be a cell phone or a tablet, so it's not a perfect match for the data that I'm collecting, but I figure it's going to be fairly reasonable. Notice that Brazil has spends the most hours on a mobile device compared to Europe, which is at the lower end. Now, it made me question why that would be, and it's always interesting that a graph like this produces more questions. My guess is that many Brazilians don't have a computer, and that they're doing a lot of their business on their cell phones instead of on a computer. I, for example, do most of my work on a computer, so as far as cell phone use goes, it's pretty minimal. By the time I get home, that's really the only time I would use a cell phone. Whereas if you were working on it on a day-to-day basis, then your hours would be obviously way higher. And so if a whole country does their cell phone, has less access to computers, then that would skew the number of hours they spend on a mobile device. I felt like I needed to check that data so that I could use that assumption with some confidence. And the first one was from comscore.com, which is another statistical trending, another company that tracks trends. And they say they figured that the US spends 2.5 hours a day on their mobile phones. So that compares very favorably with this 2.37, 2 hours and 37 minutes. They're about the same amount. So I thought, okay, that looks like the table on the left there is pretty accurate. Then I wanted to, but I felt like I needed to spot check a couple more. The next one was from CNBC News Agency. It's the Chinese adults spent 2.5 hours a day. Notice that that's a little bit less than what this website had predicted. And then thirdly, the Telegraph News in the UK said that their adults spend 2.75 hours on their phone, and if you take a look here, that looks like they've underestimated it in the Statista table. Now, in order to make this calculation a simple calculation, then I needed to look at it and take a look at the average, and I determined that the average cell phone use is about 2.5 hours a day. It looks like there's only a couple that are higher than 2.5 hours a day, and most of them are close to 2.5 hours or below. So the first thing I needed to do was to calculate the fraction of the time that people spend on their cell phone. So it's when the cell phone is in use compared to a whole day. So it was 2.5 hours divided by 24 hours in a day. So that is the fraction of time that a typical inhabitant of Earth is spending on their cell phone. And I have to multiply that by the number of cell phone users. So cell phone users times 2.5 over 24. Cell phone users, remember, was 2.7 billion. That was the assumption. Times 2.5 over 24 equals 0.28. Now what's that measured in? That's measured in billions. So that means that 28 million people are on the phone right now. Now that is a very rudimentary calculation on how many people are using their cell phone at this particular moment. It is important to always consider how to make this calculation more accurate. Where could you take this problem to the next level? One thing is that you could do a bit more research, or I could do a bit more research to make sure that I'm measuring the same thing. That distinguish between cell phone use, mobile use, as in mobile device, it could be an iPad, is there a difference, and internet use. Those statistics sort of bleed together on most websites, and it would be important to make sure that if I'm going to use this in calculations, I've got to define very accurately what I'm actually measuring. The other thing is the timestamp of the data. So it would make a difference if the data that you collected was at the beginning of 2017 or at the end of 2017, because trends in this kind of thing are going to make big changes over the course of a year. So that if we're measuring the amount of cell phone use in the US in 2017, in December 2017, we're comparing it to the cell phone use in China in December 2017, not two different timestamps. The other thing that would make it more accurate is to take a closer look at what the patterns of cell phone use are around the globe, because it might be different depending on what the country's profile is. So are all countries using their cell phones mainly during the day? And what hours? That could be different from sub-Saharan Africa compared to northern Norway. So taking those patterns into consideration will have an effect on calculating how many people are actually on the cell phone at a particular time. What the cell phones are used for can also influence when they are used. So are they used for business? Are there other internet options for countries? Would have an effect on when they're used during the day. And then time zones, taking a look at what this problem assumed to begin with, was the population was evenly distributed across the globe in all time zones, and we know that that's not the case. There's places where there's very few population and there's absolutely nobody living, for example, in the middle of the Pacific. So when it becomes noon in the middle of the Pacific, it's probably evening or early morning or late night in other parts of the world, and so maybe the cell phone use actually drops during that time because of the Earth's rotation and the different time zones. So there's lots of things to be consider if you want to take this calculation to another level.